You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of August, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
Why are the Dutch and the French so grumpy with their governments? The curious journey of mass deportation from the unspeakable fringes to mainstream opinion. And is anyone's private life really the stuff of headlines? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Rainbow Murray and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Joanne Briggs about her extraordinary book recounting her attempt to figure out who and what her celebrated father actually was. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Rainbow Murray, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and Simon Brooke, journalist and communications consultant. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Rainbow, first of all, you rejoin us fresh from a holiday, which was not, as most people would understand it, a holiday, but maybe the genesis of some enraging new trend, which fills the style sections all next summer. Explain.
That's right. I had a holiday where I stayed at home and worked a lot, and it was incredibly refreshing and rejuvenating. And what made it so was that normally I'm trying to juggle 15 different things at once. Mm-hmm. And on this particular week, I did one thing and one thing only. So I dispatched the kids to the in-laws, I turned off my email, I cancelled my meetings, I cleared my diary, I said no to almost everything, and I got one thing done and did it well, and it felt good.
It is actually, now that you say it like that, I think probably unusual for most of our listeners, and certainly myself, to try, to have a period in which you do just work on one thing, because there are always demands being blitzed at you from a variety of directions.
I think that's right. We all live fast-paced lives. We all have to multitask. There's a lot of background noise. And I think it's actually quite healthy just occasionally to drown out all that noise, to filter it out, and to allow ourselves just to focus on something for a change.
Simon, you have been doing other, I guess, kind of mind-clearing endeavours, although that doesn't seem quite the right phrase for working really hard on a thing. You attended the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy.
Yeah, I did. I go every year, but this year I decided to do it in a slightly different way, because normally I buy the guidebook and spend the whole time looking at that and then looking up at pictures just to see who created what and how much it's costs, how much it's on sale for and all that sort of thing. So, and I found it quite, I think to your point, Rainbow, I found it quite, I'm doing two things at once. You know, I'm looking at figures and names, and then I'm looking at a piece of art. So this year I decided to do it differently. I eschewed the guide and just wandered through and sort of let the art wash over me, if you like. Just sort of tried to be in the moment, not thinking about anything else, but just to absorb what I could see around me. And yeah, it was a really rewarding experience, much better than my previous visits. Because
the summer exhibition, for the benefit of our international listeners, is kind of the have-a-go show of the art world, isn't it?
Yeah, almost anybody, anybody really can submit a work. A friend of mine tried, I think, 6 years running, and finally a few years ago was accepted and was very excited as we went and saw his painting that was exhibited there. So yeah, you get this wonderful eclectic mix. There are some well-known names, but then really anybody who just thinks that they would like to create a piece of art and submit it can do so. And obviously there's a ruthless selection process. But yeah, I think it's terribly exciting if you see your work of art there. And of course, some of the things I was looking at when I went, some of the artists there would be sort of the big names over the next few years.
Well, we will start more or less simultaneously in France and the Netherlands, the voters of both of which are presently, if polls are any guide, sharpening their pitchforks. In the case of France, possibly literally. A majority of French people want new parliamentary and presidential elections, and it is widely assumed that the current government of Prime Minister François Bayrou will collapse next month when he seeks the confidence of the National Assembly. In the Netherlands, elections are due on October 29th anyway, but broadcasters may find that opportunities to utter the delightful phrase Prime Minister Dick Schoof end before then, although the latest mail is that Schoof has pretty convincingly survived a confidence vote today, and so one more time at least. Prime Minister Dick Schoof. It will never get old. Rainbow, are we judging this a little harshly, perhaps? Is this not just what politics in France and the Netherlands are basically always like, with their dozens of parties and proportional representation and other such zany goings-on?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a certain inherent quality in most countries that people will be dissatisfied with the government of the day because things invariably go wrong and whoever's in charge will get the blame for that. It's actually not the case that France has proportional representation, but what they do have is a very fractured and divided political system at the moment. And people are asking for elections because the current parliament is so hopelessly divided that they're not going to be able to get anything done. The problem is that has resulted from the last election where people voted for three different entities that couldn't work together, and all fingers point to the exact same outcome again if they have another election. So maybe rolling the dice again to get the same outcome isn't the solution. Maybe people actually need to start thinking towards compromise, but that's something which I think we don't see enough of at the moment in politics.
Simon, staying in France, almost everybody who has ever governed France has at some point remarked on the impossibility of governing France in a few celebrated occasions as they were being ushered towards the guillotine. But has it become any more or less governable than it ever has previously? Is this just France being France?
I think it was General de Gaulle, wasn't it, who said, how can you run a country which have however many different types of cheese? And I think there probably is a kind of individualism there that makes it difficult for people to coalesce. But I think France is going through something, I would say, that we're seeing here in the UK, that we've seen in the States as well, really around the world. And that's this kind of, not only have you got fractured parliaments where people, as you say, Rainbow, can't work together, but you've also got a fractured electorate as well, where people have a completely different view of the world and, are not willing to make compromises. I mean, we've seen polling in the States, for instance, and also here in the UK, which shows how people are less willing to accept somebody as a friend if they have a different point of view. And so it might sound like a trivial thing, but if you're trying to collaborate, that's really difficult. And I think one of the issues, obviously, we're seeing here in France that makes it so difficult is public expenditure, aren't we? That Francois Bayrou, the current Prime Minister, is saying to the French people, you really are going to have to cut public expenditure. We really are going to have to work harder. And yet, of course, they don't want to accept that. So this is a really difficult sell, if you like, for him to persuade people to do this. And it's difficult to imagine how any other party would. If it was one of the extreme parties, the National Rally or the France Insoumise, I think the problem there would be that you would see the markets, the people who are lending money to France, would really take fright, and that would have a really serious impact on the economy.
The big question here, Rainbow, is should President Macron step aside early and call a presidential election? To be clear, he doesn't have to until 2027. He says he won't, and given that he is term limited and can't stand again, there doesn't seem to be much incentive for him to do it. So I think we can assume he probably won't, but should he?
Well, all of his, surprisingly enough, all of his opponents think he should. And actually, a substantial portion of the electorate also think he should. The rationale behind that being that perhaps a new president might be able to regain a parliamentary majority, which Macron is completely incapable of doing. He hasn't managed it for the whole of this term, and I don't think that any number of parliamentary elections will resolve that. But it's not necessarily that straightforward. That could potentially add more fuel to the fire in a situation of instability. And one thing that he is very wary of is the fact that the far right are currently doing very well in France. And if he stands down, there is a credible threat that he would get replaced with Jordan Bardella, the leader of the far right party in France, who is unlikely to bring the political stability or the economic stability that France desperately craves. So I think the the cautionary note here would be careful what you wish for.
Just finally on this one, Simon, and to return to the Netherlands, the United Kingdom tends to get a bit snooty about the chaos of European parliaments in that, at least until very recent years, and we will get onto this shortly, the United Kingdom has had an extremely stable broadly two-party democracy. It has first past the post regional electorates rather than lists and proportional representation and other such foldy role. But is there actually an inbuilt problem? Is the UK's snooty attitude to this entirely misguided? Because there is an inbuilt problem here, it appears, with PR. The Dutch Parliament has just 150 seats. They are occupied by 10 parties. And you end up in occasionally preposterous positions, as we did in the last election, where the biggest party, the very right-wing Freedom Party, wasn't able to form a government because nobody else wanted to work with them.
Yes, what's interesting, as you say, we've always here in the UK been very snooty about proportional representation and coalitions. If you just look at the way our lower house, our House of Commons is set out, it is literally very confrontational, whereas you look at the French National Assembly and other legislatures, you've got that horseshoe ring where people can move around and form some coalition. But I think things are changing here in the UK. I think if you look at the polls, given that we have this split now, I mean, traditionally, we've always had one of the major parties has won the election and the other major party has lost and the small parties are nowhere to be seen. But now we're getting this real fracturing. So not just the traditional, what we might call the mainstream parties, but the other parties are getting an roughly equal number of votes. So we might well be heading for a situation in which we would have to have some coalition. And what's interesting is even Tory sources have been telling me that they're interested in PR, something they've never wanted to do before, but now they think it is an opportunity for them to gain power. The only problem I would say is if we did have some kind of coalition after the next election, and I do think that's pretty likely, I can't see how it's going to work to introduce stability, because it's either going to be kind of a Labour, Lib Dem, perhaps Corbynite coalition, which would really upset so many people who are now supporting reform, or it would be a Tory reform coalition, but which again would have an awful lot of, not just a lot of people against it, but a lot of people very vociferously against it. So I think we may well have a period of instability ourselves after the next election.
Well, a reminder that a recent episode of The Foreign Desk, specifically episode 607, considers the apparent increasing difficulties verging on impossibility of governing rumbustious modern democracies. Here in the UK, in semi-related news to our previous digressions, if polls are any guide, the biggest party in its next parliament could be one which presently holds all of 4 seats in the House of Commons. Reform UK, present vehicle of Nigel Farage, the man who, 1, did more than anyone else to encourage Brexit, and 2, still seems to have an audience for his line that the reason it has been such a shambles is that it just wasn't Brexity enough. Farage has announced on Reform UK's behalf a policy of large-scale deportations, anticipating removing around 600,000 migrants living illegally in the UK by means of throwing them out, paying them to go, and or paying countries to take them back, including those such as Eritrea and Afghanistan, which offer abundant reason to leave. Rainbow, you don't need a long memory to recall a time at which this sort of talk would have been regarded as way beyond the pale. How has it become not just mainstream, but possibly part of the platform of the next government?
I think when we look at the anti-immigration discourses of far-right parties, we tend to focus on the far-right party as the problem. But the reason that these things get normalised isn't because the far-right are saying it, because they've always been saying it. It's because the other parties have also started saying it and have stopped challenging it, and they see the electoral threat of reform. And rather than saying we disagree, they're trying to say, you're right, but we'd do it better. And as long as they accept and normalise that discourse, it gives parties like Reform a free pass to become more and more extreme. So it shifts everything rightwards rather than calling it out and saying, actually, maybe there is another way that we could do this.
It's not just in the UK, of course, Simon. It is 10 years this summer since Angela Merkel said we'll manage, referring to that enormous column of refugees which arrived in Germany in 2015. Again, at that time, AfD had no seats in the Bundestag. They're now the second biggest party. Is what we're seeing, this now being scaled up to saying we are going to ship large numbers of people back home whether they like it or not, is this an ongoing backlash to that moment?
I think it is in some ways, yes. I mean, there is that saying, isn't it, that if the Liberals don't control immigration, then the fascists or extreme right will. And I think that's what we've seen in Europe and in the US, after, as you say, after over the last 10 years. You know, that's one of the things that got Donald Trump elected, was that absolute hard line on immigration. So I think it's an intractable issue here. I think for Labour here in the UK, it's a very difficult for them to fight on, because I don't think they're ever going to win on the subject of immigration. I mean, it's going to be very difficult for most voters to believe that Labour is tough on immigration. It's also upsetting a lot of natural Labour supporters to hear Starmer trying to out Farage. But I think what was interesting when I was watching Farage talk yesterday was I thought even he looked slightly uncomfortable with the things he was saying. It was, as you say, a step further than he's ever gone before. And I think the problem is he feels he's got to keep moving in this direction to stay ahead of the other parties as they also move on this in this direction. And obviously he's slightly backtracked again today when he, in a press conference in Scotland, when he said, we're not even discussing women and children at this stage. There are so many illegal males in Britain. So I think what I find interesting about this is that if it just shows how volatile and how difficult the subject of immigration is, if even a politician like Nigel Farage, who is so adept at campaigning, touching on the zeitgeist, expressing people's views, if even he feels slightly on the back foot about it, I think, as I say, I think it shows what an incredibly difficult issue it is.
Because as a theoretical proposition, Rainbow, and just trying to remove as much emotion as possible from what Simon correctly identifies as an extremely emotive issue, is there anything wrong with if somebody is in a country illegally, whether they have arrived illegally, whether they have overstayed a visa, is there actually anything wrong with saying to them, you shouldn't be here, you have to go?
I think it really depends on why they're in the country illegally. If you are a genuine refugee, and we don't use the word refugee anymore, that's part of the problem. We call people migrants as if, they're cynically exploiting a situation. If you're a genuine refugee and you're trying to flee a situation that threatens your life, you're not going to sit down and do a long planned application to think, what is the best legal route into a country? You're just going to get there by any means necessary.
True.
So I think we need to distinguish between people who know that they don't deserve to be there and are just trying to to cheat the rules, and people who genuinely need a sanctuary and just didn't have the opportunity to plot a more sensible route. And that is a nuance that I think is lost in the current inflammatory discourse about it.
But to bring my question back to, let's say, the least emotive theoretical example we could think of, and one I hasten to stress not at all close to my experience, but possibly quite close to the experience of people I have known. You're overstaying Australian backpacker. If they have been in the United Kingdom past the length they were allowed on their visa, should they be, and with relative lack of ceremony or mercy, thrown out and told to go back home?
If they had no good reason for outstaying their welcome, then I think a government is within its rights to say, OK, time's up, time to go. The question is why people are here, what right they have to stay, what incentive they have for not following the correct process, whether they're trying to cheat a system or whether they were in a situation of desperation. And I think we tend to boil very complex problems down to very simplistic solutions. And sometimes in doing so, I think people's genuine needs sort of fall through the cracks, and we tend to see everybody as a villain rather than seeing a complex situation where some people are more deserving than others.
Because there is, Simon, a somewhat rugged / liberal line on this, which is that if you are a fan of immigration, and to be clear, I would count myself as such, I sure as hell would not wish to live in a country that nobody wanted to migrate to, that you have to do it properly. There have to be processes, there have to be rules, and there have to be completely understood. And I've said this before from this chair, and I try to cling to it as a beacon of hope, that it is the case that in very recent years, I think the number is nudging 200,000 people from Hong Kong have moved to the United Kingdom, a visible ethnic majority, many of whom do not speak English necessarily as a first language, and nobody cares. It's not been an issue at all, not even Reform have tried this one on. These are people who hold what are called British overseas passports. But I think it's understood that there is a reason, there is a rationale, there is a system. We know who they are. They've been vetted. They have a reason to be here. It therefore isn't a thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you as a journalist and as a political consultant, I can tell you that one of the most powerful emotions that electorates, audiences, consumers, anybody has is that sense of fairness. You know, when you were a kid and your mum and dad said, it's not that, you complained it's not fair, and your mum and dad said the world isn't fair, but we want it to be fair. And so the real thing that upsets electorates about immigration is people cheating the system. So when people arrive on a boat, the electorate feel they are cheating the system, and that's why they don't like that. Whereas, as you say, if you're a Hong Kong national who's escaping what I would say is a really evil regime, which is the Chinese government, then people think that's fair enough. And it's interesting as well, if you look at the polling on immigration, it's quite nuanced actually. Generally, people are opposed. People think we have too much immigration. But then you drill down and you say, in effect, what about your Polish builder? Oh, he's great. What about the Filipino lady who helps your lady in the car? Oh, no, she's lovely. But it's the rest of them. And I think, even from my own experience, that's great. I might see a couple of rough-looking Eastern Europeans drinking on, outside my tube station, and I feel this, not sure about immigration. But it is a very emotive issue, and a very nuanced one as well.
And it's also one where we're fired up. I think most people are actually instinctively quite tolerant. And one of the reasons why we have become less tolerant is because we've been encouraged to be less tolerant by discourses that make us afraid of or resentful towards other people. And when you don't stoke this fear, people don't actually care all that much about immigration. They care about other things. So it's often used as a sort of distraction to stop people thinking about things like the economy that are harder to fix. Immigration just becomes a scapegoat. But when you ask people, what would you be willing to sacrifice in order to reduce immigration? Would you be willing to sacrifice the economy? And people say, oh, well, no. Would you be willing to sacrifice the NHS? And people say no. So when
would you be willing to go and pick strawberries yourself?
Exactly.
Somebody's got to do it. Yeah,
exactly. But when you sort of change it as, do you want people on small boats to go away? People go, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, to the famously favourite and less divisive conversational topic of the British, i.e. the weather, of which there has arguably been more of than usual for the time of year. In the UK and across Europe, it has been widely and anxiously noted that a great many plants appear confused as to what time of year it is supposed to be. Fruit is ripening prematurely, leaves are falling early, and so are branches, to the extent that some London councils have been cautioned against seeking shelter from the heat in the shade cast by big trees, lest one get clonked by a descending bough. Simon, this is an honest question, not a comment on the quality of your discourse. Have you been hit on the head by a branch this summer?
Actually, nearly today.
Amazing.
Enough, I was. Yeah, luckily, so I nearly was actually. I thought, that was close, but no, it didn't happen. Thank goodness. But it would have given me something perhaps more interesting. As long, if it had hit me on the head, perhaps I would have suffered some kind of memory problem. I don't know. But anyway, no, it would have given me something more interesting to talk about than the weather. That's for sure.
Because I have noticed this myself, Rainbow, at which point I will out myself as one of those insufferable people who does have a garden which is big enough to have trees in it. But yes, at least one of them has let it all go way early this time of year. I've been doing a lot of raking.
Yes, and I think it's actually perhaps a bigger problem than we might recognise, because the reason why we're seeing these trees lose their leaves in August, why we're seeing a sort of an early autumn, is they're stressed. They haven't had enough rain. It's been too warm. And so they're shedding their leaves early to try and conserve energy. And they did the same thing 3 years ago as well, when we had a big heat wave in 2022. And it's okay for trees to do this once a decade. It's part of nature's cycle. But because of climate change, it's starting to happen more and more frequently. And you can't do it every 3 years because trees don't have enough time to recover in between these episodes of stress. And it's also important for wildlife. If fruits are ripening in the summer instead of the autumn, that precious food source that they need to survive the winter is gone. And then we start to see real problems with our ecosystem if we see that wildlife is struggling to survive. So what seems like a mainly aesthetic problem is actually indicative of a much more fundamental problem for our ecosystems.
I did want to ask you both, though, because it is going to be autumn, or arguably is already autumn earlier than it should be. We will see a lot of autumn discourse. Does anybody want to admit, Simon, to being one of those insufferable people who really likes autumn and bangs on and on and on about how much they like autumn?
Like Keats, honestly.
Exactly.
I have to say, it's taken me decades to get over autumn because I was associated with going back to school, and because I absolutely hated school, it was something about that feel of autumn in the air, and as you say, Rainbow, the brown leaves and stuff that used to really depress me. Whereas now I love it, I have to say, and I'm the summer's been lovely, but I'm ready for a bit of some brown leaves, some gentle rain, slightly cooler temperatures. I'm very much into my seasons now that I'm getting a bit older as well.
Awful. Although you do have a supporter in Steph in the production booth who is apparently all about autumn. Rainbow, where are you on this? Do you want to help me out here? The reason I don't like autumn, and I think it is one of those things where having a garden, you do tend to notice the season. So on the one hand, spring's great because everything just bursts into life, whereas autumn is just like, oh, good. 6 months of decay and death as I look out of my window.
I think every season in its turn. I think how I feel about autumn is also shaped by the summer that we've had. When we've had a wet and dreary summer, I feel very depressed about the onset of autumn because I think I'm not ready to face another 8 months of cold and darkness. When we've had a very prolonged, hot, dry, sunny summer, I think autumn actually offers the prospect of a bit of respite and perhaps a sort of slightly cosy feeling of being able to sort of take shelter. But I like autumn foods. I like seasonal squash, for example, and autumn fruits.
And apples and things. I have to say, and our pear tree has just given us a whole load of pears. So this is really sad, I suppose, but I'm looking forward to going home and cooking and eating pears.
Why is that sad?
Nice. I feel sort of guilty, like I shouldn't be admitting that as a man, but there you go, I really enjoy it.
I don't have any such problem because, once again, the squirrels have eaten all my apples. But we will move along to the news currently leading bulletins on every outlet but ours, i.e. the engagement of an American football player and an American pop musician. And to be clear, we will now be doing that thing of superciliously discussing reaction to the event rather than the event itself, as is traditional among such uptown programmes as the Monocle Daily. We refer, of course, to Travis Kelce, triple Super Bowl winning tight end with the Kansas City Chiefs, and Taylor Swift, gazillion-selling singer, whose story has clearly enthralled many and greatly enlivened the experience of watching any Chiefs game on TV, with the drinking game related to the number of gratuitous cutaways of Swift cheering from the grandstand. I am aware, Rainbow, I have been tipped off that I am asking this question to the mother of a Swiftie. My view on this would be good luck to them and everything, but is the attention warranted?
Everybody likes a bit of good news. And I think if we think actually back to what we were discussing earlier, when things are not quite right in the world, there are two things that you can do. You can find a scapegoat and get angry about it, or you can find a distraction and get excited about it. I would rather see people getting distracted by something happy. So most of the people who care about this actually have zero personal investment in it. They are never going to meet either of these people. They don't know them. It's just something positive to think about. My child was very happy because she said, the last few albums that Taylor Swift has done have been sad, introspective albums. I want a happy album. Does this mean we're going to get a happy album? I think sometimes people just need a little bit of feel good.
Well, yes, and of course there is always, I won't say the hope, Simon, that future events could return Taylor Swift to her country and western roots and the great old school Divorce album. But I want to put to you, in your role as a communications consultant, the views of the British public as sourced today by YouGov. They've asked them, what do you think of this, i.e. Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift getting engaged? We have great/good 18%, neutral 14%, bad/terrible 1%, and I think maybe those are people who one day hoped to meet Travis Kelce or Taylor Swift.
Marry Taylor Swift.
Indeed. But don't know, don't care, 67%. Now, I genuinely think it should be law, Simon, that all opinion polling on any subject should offer the option don't know/don't care. But I think don't care is actually important. But do you think that's honest? Is there a thing where people don't want to be caught out caring about this one way or the other?
I'm sure. I'm completely, absolutely. I mean, it is embarrassing, isn't it, to admit to wanting, to get the latest celebrity news. I mean, as we know, the Mail Online website has what's called the sidebar of shame, that sort of shocking celebrity thing, which we never look at. But the point is, once you start, 20, 30, 40 minutes can go by and you just think, I've never even heard of these people. Why am I reading about them? But so I think it's probably an element of snobbery. But this is, as you say, Rainbow, this is a lovely, positive story. And I think as celebrities go, I think for most people would say that Taylor Swift is, considering the number of sort of vacuous reality TV celebs we have foisted on us, even amongst even by the so-called quality press, I think she's quite a good role model, isn't she? She's talented, she's hardworking, she does the right thing, and now she's marrying her sweetheart. So
they are. But I mean, this is where Rainbow, I get to my good luck to the pair of them thing. They are both very talented, hardworking people in their respective fields who have done it all themselves. You cannot begrudge that, I don't think. But the only thing I could think of in terms of possibly comparable stature, and it was a secret wedding at the time, and it was a long time ago. This was Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe. That was 1954. I did look into this. The San Francisco Chronicle did put it on the front page. So does this demonstrate that really nothing changes, just the technology?
Well, you're talking to a Brit. I would say that every royal wedding has been of comparable stature. Yeah. And people do get very, very excited about a royal wedding, including plenty of people who don't actually like the royal family all that much. But when you give people a little bit of pomp and ceremony, a little bit of glam, something cheerful to get upbeat about, suddenly people are lining the streets and throwing parties and waving flags. I think people just like to have something to feel cheerful about. And if their own lives aren't delivering it, they look elsewhere.
And we can all share in it, can't we? We're not getting married ourselves, but everyone loves a good wedding, don't they?
Absolutely.
Well, on that upbeat note, Simon Brooke and Rainbow Murray, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, a thought which may disrupt one's slumbers from time to time. There are almost certainly things about our parents that we do not know, and very possibly things which, if we did know them, would startle us considerably. An admittedly extreme demonstration of this is a new book by Joanne Briggs, a sort of biography of her father, Michael Briggs, a brilliant scientist, successful executive, advisor to NASA and the WHO, but both, it turned out, somewhat less and arguably more than any or all of those. Joanne recounts her attempt to get to the bottom of it all in a new book, The Scientist Who Wasn't There, a true story of staggering deception. I spoke to Joanne earlier and began by asking if at any point in her research her nerve had failed and she'd thought about discontinuing the book.
Well, it's very interesting that you asked, because I think if I'd been younger, I would have felt differently about it. And I don't think I could have taken this particular path at any other time in my life. But I'm now approaching 62 years of age, and looking back over the decades from what you might call a place of some peace now at this point in my life, I didn't feel particularly disturbed by what I was finding out. Whereas had I been in my 30s, 40s or even 50s, I think I might have stepped back and not done it at all. It just seemed like the project of my life at that point, on the threshold of older age, where you look back down the years and try to work out really what it was all about. And part of that picture was this very mysterious figure. Of course, the title of the book is The Scientist Who Wasn't There. And you'll have discovered through the narrative there are various different ways in which my dad was a scientist who wasn't there. He wasn't there in my life. He was mostly absent. And my parents separated when I was 7, and my dad disappeared off immediately abroad and was working abroad the whole time. So I used to see him about once a year when he came back to Europe in order to go to World Health Organization meetings, in fact, in Switzerland. So he wasn't there in that sense. And then I discovered this other sense in which he wasn't there, in which he wasn't the scientist he claimed to be either. And that's the main sort of fulcrum of the story, I suppose, is that particular discovery, that my dad was an internationally acclaimed expert in his later life in hormone pharmaceuticals and biochemistry. Earlier in his life, he had a rather sort of freewheeling attitude to science and had done all sorts of things. And he'd been a lecturer in geology in the early 1960s and then eventually ended up at NASA Caltech working on the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's manned missions to Mars that were being planned in the early 1960s. So he'd had all these other things going on. But at the root of it all was a sense that he was entitled to claim to be things that he was not. And he did not have the qualifications that we had always believed that he had.
But there's a parallel narrative which arrives as well, in which you discover that while he was less than he claimed to be in some respects, such as those, there were other areas in which he might have been more than he claimed to be. Elsewhere, there is a curious and apparently genuine cameo from Stanley Kubrick, which leads you to wonder who he was really working for all along.
Well, the Stanley Kubrick thing is rather strange. He had been working, as I said, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories with Arthur C. Clarke and others in the early 1960s and had maintained those contacts and had always claimed to me that he had had a role in the making of 2001 A Space Odyssey, which as a child I accepted at face value. And then when I discovered all of the lying and pretense, I thought, well, that one can go in the bin. That's extremely unlikely. And then I discovered, after all, that there's an exchange of correspondence in the Kubrick archive, which shows that he was genuinely telling the truth. And I think what you're adverting to as well about sort of secret lives is that there is also some evidence that he was doing covert work on behalf of the government. That when he returned with my mother and my infant brother to the UK in 1963, just shortly before I was born, he took a job in Corsham in Wiltshire, which is actually, I discovered, most people don't seem to know this, neither did I, was the centre for the Cold War headquarters for the government and the administration of government, which were at the time top secret and which are now locked away. They're behind lock and key, so you can't go and visit, sadly. I very much like to go. So there are sort of secrets and lies all over the place, really, with my dad's story, and trying to pick it all apart is really quite a hard job. But he had a very high security clearance in order to work at NASA. So consequently, when he moved back to the UK and appeared to be working for an animal feed manufacturer, that's not a very likely job that he would have taken after NASA.
You would think not.
and the location isn't very likely either.
I do want to make clear to listeners who have not yet read the book that what we have so far discussed is barely even the half of it. It is just the most extraordinary story. But I do want to ask, just finally, because most people at some level in their lives, professionally or personally, will encounter somebody who is perhaps not to the extraordinary degree of your late father, but something of a fabulizer, somebody whose relationship with reality is, let's say, erratic. Did you ever get any sense of what drives a character like that? Is it just boredom with the real world? Is it ambition outstripping accomplishment? Is it a sense of entitlement to things they think they deserve but don't have? What actually is it?
I think all of those things, firstly. But I also want to say that the book isn't, in the end, a sort of total takedown of my dad, in the sense that I think I found out more about him and understood him better as a man, having found out all of these possible strands in his life, both the imagined, the fabricated and the real, because he was, when all's said and done, a working class man from Manchester. But I think that he didn't think, as a member of that post-war generation that gets the opportunity to go to university, on the threshold of getting what you want, you discover that there are people who are ahead of you because they are financially or educationally in better positions to get what you want. So consequently, I think his drivers were his origins and his ambition and bridging the gap between the two, that he either real or perceived gap, that he wasn't going to actually get to NASA unless he pretended to have qualifications that he didn't have, I suspect. And consequently, once you've started pretending to have qualifications that you don't have, he had to continue with the pretense. And I think arguably at the end of his life, he had this rather dramatic encounter with his pretense, in that once the Sunday Times expose about his research had happened, they'd uncovered the fact that he was pretending to carry out research that he hadn't done. But what the Sunday Times did not uncover was that he shouldn't have been in that position in the first place. And I think that nexus, that event, when everything blew up in his face, led arguably to the unknown circumstances of his death. But the result is that the fabricated self, I think, was his real self. And I think he'd genuinely probably forgotten that he'd made it all up until the Sunday Times expose in 1986.
That was Joanne Briggs. Her book is called The Scientist Who Wasn't There, a true story of staggering deception. It is very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Rainbow Murray and Simon Brooke. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermack and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.